Let's go. That's why I don't do that small screen. But if you could really label just looking at the factors. You want something kind of this is a really hard. Sometimes it can actually pick up how many ways. Bro, he's big, man. Yeah, yeah. Really? No, well, they could have to give you a 25. Oh, I didn't joke about this.
I can think of no better introduction. Sadly, there's no subtitles for that. That's the only thing that really could make it worse, right? All right, so this week we are talking about constitutional rights and the internet, which means we're talking about freedom of speech, which means we're talking about obscenity and indecency and how we in America have addressed that through evolving technologies leading up to and on the internet. Now, of course, this chart here is glib. It is wrong. No answers, no questions actually are answered on the internet. That pie slice there should probably be fighting with other people about their opinions. But other than that, the truth is that since the inception of the internet, the beginning of this technology, yeah, there's a lot of porn on the internet. As soon as we had this mass media ability to communicate, decentralization of publishing authority, the amount of adult materials that appeared on the internet instantaneously took up, probably about that much, I suppose, of the total internet. And yes, for most people, the internet is what they need to do in their daily lives, their email and whatever they do for work, and then social media and everything else is. There's a reason why it is what it is. There's a reason why we handle it the way that we handle it, but it's still in a sort of limbo, if you will, in terms of a lot of ways that it's regulated. Because the truth of the matter is that while we are in this unit talking about the Constitution of the United States and your rights on the internet, the fact of the matter is you don't really have any rights on the internet because it does not belong to America as much as Americans might like to hope or wish that it does. Truth is the internet is not, I mean, the research was funded even only in part by the United States government. There's plenty of other research that contributed to the rise of this technology that comes from places outside the internet, or sorry, outside of America. And even if it were the case that the internet is American, it does not extend to foreign nationals, and a lot of your rights don't extend to private property. And so we kind of need to talk about that because for many of us, we are so used to these rights being honored regardless of where we are that we almost come to expect it in certain places, especially in places where it doesn't apply. And even if we were to say all of that weren't the case, would your rights still apply on the internet? Well, the answer is still no in a third way, because everyone here, despite the fact that you are American citizens, well, I assume most of you are American citizens anyway, that your constitutional rights can be suspended and are every time you cross a border. And the internet, it could be argued, is a border. So in any event, we need to talk about these because even though you don't have rights that extend to cyberspace, your rights that you do have as Americans do shape the content that goes on the internet and the way that it's consumed. And even though all of that is the case, there are many US cases, both torts and criminal, that do rest upon a constitutional basis in their decision, meaning that even if the Constitution or your constitutional rights don't extend to private property, don't extend to the internet, and don't extend to bordered situations, they are still the basis for legal decision making. So we kind of have to talk about them if we're going to proceed to talking about pretty much anything else after this point. So, of course, we begin at the beginning with the big one, which is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The last one you might assume is the least relevant of those. However, a number of years ago, about 12 or so ago, the Obama administration did essentially open up a pipeline on the internet for direct communication with the government, which of course was immediately co-opted by bots and so on. But it's still around, change.org. You can still fill out petitions. It didn't end up being everything the Obama administration wanted it to be, but it is still around and it is still at least ostensibly shaping policy. There have been many other attempts by other lawmakers or other politicians to open up a similar avenue direct to the political base as such in order to take the temperature and guide their policy and so on, all of which again were immediately co-opted by bots. One of them was, which one was this? It was, I can't recall which if this was in the Obama administration, but a political rival that had done this, or if this was actually in George W. Bush's administration. But there was, for a time, rather than having a completely digital sort of petition process, They instead had a pseudo-digital process where what would happen is you could sign a petition, and what it would do is it would actually physically print out paper with your name and everything on it. And it was being broadcast 24/7 via webcam, which was just great fun. I believe that Weed Lord Boner Hitler signed that petition at least 30 times. But yeah, things like that. Because again, the internet, as we talked about before, is the public forum. It is the political forum in the United States these days. It has been for a couple of decades now. It's not going away anytime soon. We've only just recently begun to see the results of that with our inability to accurately or as accurately predict political outcomes. Because traditionally, just like with the centralization of publishing authority allowed us to better regulate content that was published, the centralization of political discourse also meant that it was easy for us to, for example, do exit polling or to even survey the audience before and after a political debate. And we can't really do that as easily anymore because everything is too decentralized, which is why the 2016 election came as such a surprise to just about everybody, out in traditional media who had been doing political news coverage for years. The right of people to peaceably assemble might also seem like it's a little bit less important. It certainly doesn't apply to, well, it doesn't seem at least to apply to any sort of pornography problem, but it actually does. We will talk about a case in just a few minutes, for example, where somebody who was involved with the trade of contraband materials was granted on a constitutional basis their right to use the internet to peaceably assemble. The freedom of speech one, that's really the big one because it complicates everything. The press is a big one because it complicates everything. Because before, what is the press essentially was whoever was connected to a centralized publishing authority. Anybody who had the ability to publish news or to write news to be published could be granted a press pass, just a fancy little piece of paper that says that you have rights. That's all it really was. There was no permission granted with press passes, except of course for identifying them as members of the press in order to gain access to otherwise secured areas. But now, what is the press? Do we issue a press pass to anybody who has a certain number of followers? Anybody that's got a YouTube channel? That's not going to limit it very much. And does that right to assemble extend to digital associations? Does it extend to the right to, for example, the Proud Boys to assemble online, right? Who knows? Well, we do. We'll find out, I guess. Plus, there are already existing prior to the internet certain limitations to the freedom of speech. And again, the internet kind of complicates that, but they do still exist and they are still out there and they're certainly being enforced. So first with the press. Again, it's not worse, it's just different. And we find ourselves in a situation where we are addressing issues that we previously didn't necessarily consider. Prior to the internet, people impersonating members of the press in order to gain access to celebrities and politicians and so on was absolutely nothing new. But it is, again, harder to make that determination. Is Perez Hilton a member of the press? If so, should they be granted a press pass in order to, actually, hold on, I don't even think they're around anymore, are they? Well, I guess insert your favorite celebrity paparazzi blogger there. But in any event, should they get access to the White House press corps? Certainly in that case, I don't think anyone's making that argument, but what precisely is the reason for denying such a pass? Essentially what we've done in terms of the freedom of the press is we have simply replaced the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers were replaced out of necessity, whereas before, who was or was not press was up to those who held that publishing authority, the editors or producers and so on of these various different news agencies. Instead, now the gatekeepers of who is or is not press has instead been switched to those that are holding the event. It's not an outcome that was initially considered or even considered to be desirable in the time when these bills of the Bill of Rights was actually written and codified. As a matter of fact, it might be argued that it's kind of an affront to the entire concept of freedom of press. It's sort of like the foxes guarding the hen house in that case. But we no doubt do have a problem. This is a much more complicated question than we could possibly have anticipated. So what is the criteria? Well, here we have a recent case, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, freedom of association, a First Amendment issue. Back in 2017, Lester Packingham Jr. was convicted of having, this was not a contraband pornography case. This was a case where he had actually assaulted a child. So of course, he went through the legal system and was convicted, had himself a trial, was convicted at trial, was sentenced. And of course, part of that sentencing involves registering as a sex offender, even in North Carolina here. And so he decided to fight back because as a condition of his parole, he was prevented from using Facebook. So he did not solicit the minor for any contraband images over Facebook, but they did have contact over Facebook. If you're not familiar with how this system works, typically speaking, in the criminal justice system, there is, of course, a part of the Bill of Rights that prevents cruel and unusual punishment. And so that means that the actual sentencing of offenders in the criminal justice system is restricted mostly to certain what are known to be approved or humane punishment methods. So generally incarceration or fines, that kind of thing. But when it comes to probation, parole, essentially deference for what is or is not considered cruel and unusual is on an individual basis, which is why you read about those articles like that judge from Texas that used to sentence juvenile offenders to standing outside in public with a sign that said something like, I'm a terrible person who doesn't listen to their parents and stuff like that. That wasn't that long ago, so you might have heard about those. But that's essentially why. There's a lot of deference there. And typically, in cases like this, limitations on technology are perfectly standard fare, particularly where technology was used in the commission of the crime. When Packingham fought back, he was actually rejected on appeal, but then went to the Supreme Court, which unanimously decided that indeed, not allowing a person access to social media does essentially violate their civil rights under the First Amendment. They have a right to peaceably assemble and a right to voice their speech. So freedom of speech, of course, not to be taken lightly in a technology that essentially acts as a medium for instant mass communication. But there have always been limits to this freedom, and I'm sure you've at least heard these touched on before, but without a doubt, the freedom of speech as found in the First Amendment is one of the most misunderstood amongst people. We do teach civics in junior high and high school and so on, but these are those kinds of things that for some people just don't seem to stick. And then when you throw what is an otherwise shaky understanding of these rights into a new medium like this new technology, well, preconceived notions will quickly fall apart. And it's not for any of us, of course, to be legal decision makers, but we don't have to be because there's case law on these. There have been plenty of First Amendment cases decided here with regards to the internet. Now, generally speaking, as I mentioned before, the first limitation on your freedom of speech is private property. And the internet is private property. Which is why whenever you hear about the cancel culture thing, and we are going to talk about cancel culture this week. At least we're going to start it this week. We'll get to it a little bit later on as well. But when you hear the terms cancel culture, it's generally applied in the circumstance of somebody on social media who feels like they are being blacklisted because of what they're saying or their thoughts or whatever, however they choose to frame it. Well, without getting into that topic a little bit too early, the truth of the matter is that when you're on private property, whether that be somebody else's lawn or Meta or Twitter, you just simply don't have the right to say whatever you want. You can be excised from their property. Same thing if you were to go down to Starbucks or something and well, actually, you know what? If you were to go to McDonald's and jump up and down on the counter demanding Szechuan sauce, you can be excised from your property because it's private property. So freedom of speech does not equal freedom to be heard. It does not obligate anyone to pay attention to you. It does not obligate anyone to platform you. It does not obligate anyone from spreading your message or sharing it. So a lot of times you also hear about being shadow banned, which is another way that the menacing cancel culture handles those who would dare go against what's perceived to be a mainstream message. It's a regulation of speech if the algorithm does not promote a message. That's simply just not the case. So the first limitation is that, and it's a pretty big one, obviously, when it comes to the internet, right? So in addition to that, however, you might say, well, don't I have a right to speak somewhere? And if the internet is not the public, or is the public forum or the political forum, or all of those things, then is excising me from those places not a still violation of my civil rights? And the answer is yes, that may be. But do remember that even before the internet, the government did have the right to regulate speech, even if they can't prevent it. So the government, even before the internet, since way back when the First Amendment was first codified, may still regulate speech via time, place, and manner, meaning that you still don't have a right necessarily to specifically Facebook or Twitter, or even if the government ran a social media outlet of some kind, would not necessarily be forced to platform a message. And the backlash from all of this, because again, the internet is not American, not by any stretch of the imagination. One of the things we're actually going to talk about this week as well is the Arab Spring. Is anyone already familiar with that term? You've heard it before? Good. A couple of people, good. So way back in 2012, okay, actually, let's go back a little bit farther. Around 2004 to 2008 is a time of redefining the internet. Search engines already existed a few years before that with the launch of Google in '99, sort of changed our information seeking systems and made it much easier to locate things that we were looking for. But really in that 2004 to 2008 timeline, when social media came around, it sort of connected people in a similar way. Scarcely 4 years later in 2012, after a series of local incidents in Tunisia, I believe it was, in protest of the government seizing his food cart, he was operating a food cart without a license. The government seized it, and in protest, a man lit himself on fire. This is 2012. Social media is now a thing and is embedded in everyone's lives worldwide. And for the first time, that message, which, unfortunate to say, by that point, was certainly not necessarily an isolated incident, but was an instance of injustice, which was then able to be shared across social media, leading to what is now known as the Arab Spring, and political demonstrations and revolutions throughout all of North Africa and the Middle East, the ramifications of which are still being felt today. But the ramifications in that case is not necessarily always positive, because of course, when this was seen, those who had much to lose from a destruction in the status quo clamped down, right? So we began to see in earnest a true state regulation of content on the internet. Whereas prior to that, in the 90s and so on, which we'll talk about also in a moment, it was really more of content regulation under the guise of trying to make the internet a safer place for children. And so that's why even now today, and this is of course not a complete map anymore because this is from 2014, but we do have a attempt to stifle what is otherwise free speech on the internet, because it's not American, and not everyone has that right. And there's a discussion, of course, to be had as to whether or not it is a human right rather than just simply an American right. But still, the point is that content regulation is rampant. It's all over the place. Even nation states will do it. North Korea, China, Iran, especially when it comes to people's ability to communicate and share information. All right, so the regulation of content on the internet, at least for us, goes back quite a long ways, pre-internet. Case called Kovacs v. Cooper from 1949. And it's relevant here because this is the first case. So this case was in California. And Cooper had himself a sound truck. What a sound truck was is basically, think of an ice cream truck, except instead of playing a little jingle, it has a bullhorn on top. And while it's driving around, the person who's in the truck in the back is kind of shouting things through this bullhorn. Kovacs found this to be offensive, particularly because Cooper was broadcasting the availability of adult material, if I remember correctly. And so the case went to court, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court determined essentially that while we may have obscenity or indecency laws in place to govern materials that can be found via one technology, basically every time there's a new technology that is self-selected by society to act as its primary communication mechanism, we have to once again reevaluate every single time. So every time there's a movie, just because a book, let's say, for example, the 1964 now hold on, if I'm going to say this, let me at least get it right. I gotta look this up. Um, 1962, I apologize. The 1962 Stanley Kubrick directed film Lolita was based on a novel. The novel was written in 1955 by Vladimir Nabokov. And at the time of its publication in 1955, it was positively scandalous, and yet was still published with relatively little opposition, right? It was one of those dime store paperback novels that people used to kind of pull their fedora down low before they would go in there and buy these brilliant materials and so on. Stanley Kubrick, even in 1962, was a well-respected director, up and coming at that time, but still, but that film faced a lot of backlash. And Kovacs v. Cooper was actually cited in some of the opposition to it, simply because when the story transfers to a new media, it's not necessarily the same thing. Maybe it's not so bad as a book, but it's much worse as a film. And of course, a film is a transformative work, we'll talk about in a moment, meaning that it may choose to focus on different things that the book sort of glossed over. Just the fact that it's visual imagery instead of written may change things significantly. And so now, when things move to the internet, we kind of find ourselves all over again asking ourselves the same questions over and over. Now, in the case of the film, it was toned down significantly. And we do this all the time today. We kind of accept censorship in a lot of ways in our lives simply because it's been around, right? We have the Motion Picture Association of America, which has a rating system. If that board, that body of individuals, and it is a body of individuals that surveys a work in progress, if they threaten an NC-17 rating, which used to be an X rating, they can significantly impact the outcome of a film, simply so that it can be marketable. And that is the key to this, because in Kovacs v. Cooper, it's a civil case. So it's alleging essentially that someone's civil rights had been violated. And for Cooper, it was not, he himself did not have indecent motives, I guess we could say. As we'll find over and over again in these cases, he had the most American of motives of all, which was profit. He owned a business. He wanted to advertise. He wanted to make money. And so really that's what it comes down to when it comes to censorship over and over again. We see that it is economics that tends to motivate us more than anything else. As for the rest of those, as long as we get a product out of it, we're often willing to tolerate it to a certain extent, although the outrage is often real. All right, so the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is part of this as well. So with the rise of the internet, oh, and for those of you in 361, I apologize. A lot of this is going to sound really familiar since I accidentally delivered a good portion of this lecture during the class a few weeks ago. Sorry. But the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is relevant here as well, because one of the things that was initially the foot in the door in terms of regulating content over the internet was with intellectual property rights. Prior to the 1999 DMCA, we did have several laws on the books that did govern things like trademarks and copyright, but again, the internet is a new animal. So what happened is the United States entered into the WIPO Treaty, the Worldwide International Property Owners or something like that. I can't remember exactly what that acronym is, but in any event, the result of the WIPO Treaty is that the United States would enter into that treaty and as a condition thereof, within a certain amount of time, pass their own law governing international property rights, because while the United States had the Lanham Act and so on to govern trademarks and copyright within our borders, no nation at that time really had too much concern over international rights. So we did just that with the DMCA in 1999. Now, the DMCA does have some limitations on freedom of speech as well. So for example, it's not considered free speech to simply steal somebody else's work, unless, of course, you are doing one of the things that would fall under fair use. So you see so much content on the internet that seems to be farcical or satirical, or YouTube personalities, for example, being so very, very careful with the exact amount of time they use of copyright music or the exact amount of clip they show in one of their reaction videos, for example, because it must clearly fall within the confines of fair use or it gets demonetized. So another economic incentive essentially to comply with what is otherwise censorship. The system in that case is also fairly broken, not because of the DMCA, although the US Copyright and Patent Office is working on revising that, but because well, we'll talk about safe harbor, I guess, in just a moment. But safe use on the internet in order to not be restricted speech essentially amounts to one of these conditions. So it either has to be commentary, which is why they're so careful about how much content they reuse in reactions, search engines, parody, criticism, news reporting, research, and scholarship. Fair use does not protect one from another traditional limitation of freedom of speech, which is libel, slander, and defamation. That's a separate issue we'll get to in just a moment. You also see on the internet all over the place are going to be places where people are congregating and discussing things like defeating digital rights management software or trading in ROMs and so on and so forth. Question is do those count as well? And they are, if they're considered abandoned works, abandonware, or orphan works, it's sort of a gray area because while still technically under copyright and still technically an infringement of intellectual property, no one's fighting the fight. So that's why you see it so rampantly. Speaking of DRM, the DMCA does contain provisions that do make pirating illegal, even if you're not actually sharing intellectual property. So actually doing anything to defeat technological protection measures that effectively control access to such work or defeating DRM is also technically a violation of DMCA. But to make it clear, the DMCA is not a criminal statute. It is a civil statute. And what that means is that if you defeat DRM, like for example, if you download songs through the iTunes store and then you rip them to another device, it would require the copyright holder coming after you and suing you for doing that in order for it to be stopped. So not likely to happen if it's one of those things that you're not sharing. Let's leave it at that. Oh yeah, as for why places like YouTube and other social media platforms tend to favor so heavily those who hold copyrights, at least in terms of their initial esteem when it comes to any potential abrogations of their copyright. The answer is because of what's known as safe harbor provisions. So the DMCA carves out one tiny exception for internet service providers. And YouTube Twitter and other social media platforms are not internet service providers, but in order to stay well within the bounds of the law as far as they're concerned, they will adhere to safe harbor provisions as well. So basically, what safe harbor allows for under the DMCA right now is essentially if you're providing a service and you don't do anything to facilitate intellectual property theft, you don't do anything to make yourself aware beforehand of the violation, and you respond swiftly to any takedown notices, you're in the clear. And so, of course, there's no billion-dollar company on the world that is going to take the side of an average user over a media conglomerate, which is why they tend to err on the side of copyright takedown notices when they do. It's just a way to save themselves. There's another broad provision in the DMCA, or other than the DMC safe harbor provision, that tends to guide most of the decision-making processes of websites these days, known as Section 230. And let's just jump to that, I suppose. So, question is, with all of this content being hosted online, if the DMCA only covers intellectual property theft, copyright, trademark, or what have you, then what other requirement would a website have for moderating the content on their sites, right? What other laws do they have to worry about? Well, it turns out they don't. They don't have to worry that much. Of course, most of the moderation, as we talked about before, on the internet comes through volunteer moderators. Occasionally, you'll come across a platform that has paid moderators. Law enforcement does not moderate any content out on the internet. They are there, if at all, generally investigating other things that are going on, and not necessarily that interested in stopping manipulation or naughty words and so on from being said online. So the answer is that most of that volunteer moderation and most of that even paid moderation is essentially entirely voluntary. Voluntary in the sense that no one is legally obligating them to do it, but involuntary, I suppose, in the sense that if they do not, then they are essentially or possibly liable for anything that may happen as a result of any speech that occurs on their platform. So we will actually talk about a case in just a moment, so I suppose we'll get back to that. But essentially the root of all of this comes from what is known as Section 230. So once upon a time, there were two internet service providers. There was Prodigy and there was CompuServe. They each got into hot water in two different legal cases. CompuServe was sued by Cubby Inc. Prodigy was sued by Stratton Oakmont Incorporated. And that is the same Stratton Oakmont as the Wolf of Wall Street. So that guy sued them. The two cases, however, despite their similarities as being internet service providers, were actually extremely different. Back in the old days, I was a CompuServe customer. I did have Prodigy for a little while, but I had a problem with Prodigy in that I was a teenager and I did not like how heavily moderated it was. Prodigy billed itself as being a family-friendly internet service provider from the very beginning. They wanted to have a place where the kids could come after school, hop on the chat room, talk to their friends about Oregon Trail, I guess back in those days. And whatever else, of course, they would happen to talk about. Whereas CompuServe had a very laissez-faire approach to their consumer base. They just provided the service. They didn't do anything else. And it was so bad, as you see here, a former Prodigy subscriber. They got so involved in moderating and clamping down on foul language, banning users for getting into simple arguments, and so on, that at one point on a coin collecting forum, oh yeah, sorry, let me also specify this was a time when internet service providers also provided a platform because there was no browser. So you'd get a client, and then it would allow you to access different like Usenet sites and chat rooms and stuff. But the forum got nuked because it was a coin collecting forum, and somebody used the frame Roosevelt Dime, and there was a user named Roosevelt Dime, so they got a hit on the user list, and it caused the forum to basically shut down for a while. So both of these were sued for similar reasons. In the case of Prodigy, a user on an investing forum, and again, this is the same Stratton Oakmont from Wolf of Wall Street. So this person at the time was maligning Stratton Oakmont and their business practices, if you can believe it. And so was sued by them. Cubby, the same deal here on CompuServe. In both cases, neither company actually defamed either of the plaintiffs in these cases. Their platform merely hosted that content. The result is that Prodigy lost their case and CompuServe won theirs. Prodigy lost their case because they were so heavily moderating things, billing themselves as being the moderated internet service provider, that they crossed a line in the eyes of the trier of fact to the point where they were no longer merely hosting the content, but they were actually producing or publishing it. Whereas CompuServe, with their laissez-faire attitude, saved them because they were just the place where it was hosted. They did not have anything to do with assuring that things were true and so on. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, then why moderate anything? And believe me, people like this in the mid and late 90s were scared shitless of that, because this was the mid 90s and now business was getting involved in the internet. We're selling pizzas over the internet, people. We got to make sure we protect that pepperoni dollar. So what they did with a swiftness I have not seen before or since, passed what's known as, well, they have a bill, but a section in a bill that contained a provision for this known as Section 230. Because as Christopher Cox, who I think is still around if I'm not mistaken, I remember the name not too long ago, said it struck me that if the rule was going to take hold, the internet would become the Wild West and nobody would have any incentive to keep the internet civil. Well, thank God they passed that law. The civil, safe internet. That's what I think of when I think of the internet, civil. So what Section 230 did, known affectionately as the 26 words that made the internet, essentially indemnified on a broad scale all internet service providers and web content hosters. It says, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So what that means is that I can go online. If you say something illegal, I'm not in trouble for viewing it. The website's not in trouble for hosting it, and so on. The problem, of course, is that it does not indemnify one or the other, or any of us really, from things that are not in a legal sense controllable, like public opinion. And it does not include laws that exist to prevent contraband materials. So if it's already illegal, or if it violates somebody's intellectual property, not acceptable. It's not, the site is still responsible for that. So what this all boils down to is when it comes to the moderation that you see on social media and so on, Twitter is fine. They're not responsible for any of that. This is what they're worried about right here, right? And that once again brings us to the topic of cancel culture. No, it doesn't. I forgot about this. So since the mid-90s, there have been some changes and improvements to trying to regulate content on the internet, but mostly when it comes to the activities of the site being discriminatory in some sense. So for example, there was a case, Fair Housing Council of San Fernando Valley via roommates.com. This site, if you've never used it, because I don't think it's around anymore, What it did is it tried to match, like, okay, I'm moving to the San Fernando Valley. I'm not a smoker. It's really important that I not live with a smoker. So match me up with non-smokers. I also tend to stay up late. You know, I gotta get diamond ranked before I go to bed or something like that. So I'm up every night. So I want somebody who's also a night owl, not going to be bothered by me being up, so on and so forth. Well, the problem is that they asked for information about their race. So they would match roommates up by their preferred races. I don't know what they were thinking either. But obviously that ended up being discriminatory in the end. And so roommates.com was found liable for that. And as a result of that and other bills meant to stem the flow of sex trafficking online, a number of other bills were passed. So if you've ever asked yourself, you know, why did Craigslist go family friendly, or why is there no more Backpage.com? It's because of these laws that were enacted in 2018, I believe. FOSTA SESTA. These are more limitations on Section 230, which is another reason, in addition to the stigma of hosting objectionable content, why sites suddenly kind of made a bunch of major changes and moderate more heavily the content that they find online. So for example, Craigslist, this actually happened quite a long time ago. So if you don't remember that, Craigslist used to have online personals, like a dating section. And then they also used to have an adult services section for all kinds of stuff. I mean, you know, you're all grown-ups here. You know what they were advertising on there for real. But they got rid of it because it was overtly sexual in nature, and they had no way of vetting if, okay, well, number one, it used to be a hilarious joke to post an ad, put your friend's number on there. And two, they had no way of knowing if any of the adult services that were being advertised were by people who were the victims of trafficking or not. And so what happened, interestingly enough, is after Craigslist did this, the trafficking didn't go away. Every once in a while, you'll see really strange ads on Craigslist. Let's say like, you'll see ads that are like very clearly coded information. Like you'll see somebody who's selling a can of SpaghettiOs for 150 bucks. And you find out that it's a dime bag's worth of SpaghettiOs. It's from Mexico. It's got green crystals on it and all this kind of, like, okay, like we're not talking about SpaghettiOs here. Well, they do the same thing with human beings too. They'll post an ad, like for example, advertising for $10,000, the Tina desk or something like that. They're selling a person. It's just this vague, weird language they're using to avoid detection. Craigslist, as far as their rights and responsibilities under FOSTA SESTA, they are fine in that case because it's not overtly advertising any adult materials. And also, they don't exactly have enough volunteer moderators to take care of those things. All right, so let's get back to decency. A little bit of history. 1996, in addition to Section 230, we also, as a nation, stood up proudly and passed the Communications Decency Act. It did not last long, and there was a major reason for that. So, the main aim of the CDA was to attempt to regulate the internet to make content acceptable for children. Essentially, they passed two laws in the mid-90s, one of them completely indemnifying web hosts from any material on their site, and the other one regulating decent material for children on the internet. We've talked a couple of times about this nation and cognitive dissonance. Does that not sound like the case here? Indeed, indeed it was. Because the problem that they had created for themselves in this case is that they had simultaneously classified internet service providers and content hosts as distributors of content instead of publishers. And I know that those two words might sound very similar, but in a legal sense and in the legal tradition brought to us from jolly old England back in the olden days through common law, Those two terms have very different and distinct legal definitions and different and distinct legal responsibilities. So in the case of Prodigy v. Stratton, Oakmont, and Cubby v. CompuServe, CompuServe was classified as merely a distributor. In pre-internet times, the distributor of content would be like the newsstand on the corner. So you're in the city, you're walking down the street, there's a newsstand, they're selling papers, magazines, candy, and stuff. You pick up a paper. If you don't like what you read, are you going to sue the newsstand? No, you sue the publisher of the paper. So CompuServe was just a distributor. They were just the endpoint in a chain of events that eventually led to the creation and hosting of that content. They did not have anything to do with it themselves. But since Prodigy was so heavily involved in moderation, they essentially became editors. That made them the publisher. CDA, when it was enacted, tried heavily to restrict decency. Just like distributor and publisher, there are two words in our legal tradition that have very different meanings but sound the same. There is material that is indecent, and there is material that is obscene. We cannot regulate indecent material because of the First Amendment, right? We simply cannot say in a moral sense something is wrong because we do not have a codified legal morality. Attempts to regulate decency are attempts to regulate morality. Obscenity is a different thing. Obscenity has an objective metric not based in morality, which we'll talk about in just a moment, but the CDA, the Communications Decency Act, as the name implies, regulated essentially in a moral sense content, while at the same time, another law saying that those providers and hosts were under no obligation to regulate the moral content of anything that they hosted. So the CDA was pretty swiftly gutted, but it was replaced with COPPA and CIPA. COPPA is still around, although it had parts of it struck down as well. CIPA is still around. If you remember what school was like when you were in your grade school or high school or whatever, if you're here in the cybersecurity track, you probably remember how terrible their security was and probably asked yourself, why do they even bother with this junk? I'm like 10 and I can figure this out. This is why. They didn't do it for security. They did it because CIPA applies to K through 12 schools and requires them to have internet content filters to receive federal funding. So they just had to have something in place. They didn't have to make sure that it worked. You seem like you're familiar with this, right? Yep. Well, this is why. And this is where we see attempts to attempts to regulate content on the internet in terms of decency, in terms of the material itself, is exceedingly difficult, nigh impossible to do because of our tradition of freedom, America, and all that. But it's easy to do because the government often controls the purse strings. And so that's why CIPA is still around, and it is what it is, and it is as it is. That's also why COPPA is largely still around as well, because what COPPA does is essentially tells these same web content hosts and internet service providers what they can or cannot monetize based on the age of the user, which is why if you ever upload anything to YouTube, it asks you, is this meant for anyone under 13? It's why you seem to be 13 in order to use any social media platform. That's why. This applies to anyone 13 and younger. They simply can't monetize user data if they're below the age of 13. Which is why it's so weird. I've never met anyone who's younger than 13 on the internet. It's strange. So their CDA is actually still in law. It is still in use, but it was gutted to the point where it didn't do anymore what they wanted it to do. But it is still out there and does cover up some of what is going on. All right, so we talked about Kovacs v. Cooper. Reno v. ACLU from 1997 was the first case that I'm aware of where the First Amendment was applied to the internet. And it was putting to the test the newly minted CDA. And this was when it was gutted. So the Supreme Court, when ruling on the constitutionality of the CDA, said that it was unconstitutional because it regarded the display and transmission of indecent communications. And this was actually really fast too, because normally the Supreme Court wouldn't deem to take on a case with a new technology like this, not understanding it or knowing the ramifications of such a decision. But because of Kovacs v. Cooper, they already had they had no ability to stave off this case. They kind of had to address it because the whole world was waiting for some legal distinction on how content on the internet even could be regulated. So essentially, what the court in this case, just in a nutshell, decided on was essentially that the First Amendment, in terms of our ability to communicate on the internet, is more or less absolute in terms of indecent communications, which is partly why the internet is for porn. Also, interestingly enough, I didn't think to include this in the slides, but interestingly enough, people and their preoccupation with pornography has incidentally led the way in a lot of technological revolutions. So for example, the rise of VHS over Betamax, the rise of DVD over VHS and so on, porn is almost always early adopters to new technologies and really seems to push people towards those technologies because they got to get their porn, but also Avatar, right? So yeah, DVD over Laserdisc over VHS, that was, porn studios made that switch years before any major studio started doing that. And VR today, same deal, right? It's just interesting. And if you really do want to research that kind of thing, often places like Pornhub and so on will release their data in the form of a report every year, which they of course anonymize. They don't have any one user's data on there. But things like if you're ever curious about what is the main search term for each state in the United States or each country, or when are their when are their users browsing? How long do they browse? How many videos do they have open in their tabs, kind of a thing. All that information is out there, and I consider it to be fascinating, but it's way outside of what we're talking about here. All right, so there is a difference between decency and obscenity. We cannot regulate decency because that is a moral judgment, and moral judgments are well beyond the scope of what we have in our legal arena to regulate, and not in violation of our First Amendment rights. Obscenity, on the other hand, is a legal term, and we regulate that plenty. We regulate that all the time. For example, you can't mail obscene material or crime inciting matter, of course, in this case. You can't sell obscene material on federal property, which, oh my God, I got to get rid of that at my booth in the post office, I guess. But you can't broadcast obscene material, of course. You can't engage in business of selling or transferring obscene material, and so on and so forth. I mean, not without the legal definition. So as I said, we can do this with obscene material because we do have a legal standard, an ostensibly objective, non-moral standard, though I guess in reality it's actually based on contemporary morals, but contemporary morals is a moving target. So our legal definition for obscenity comes from a case, Miller v. California, where Miller owned an adult bookstore and was selling the materials from his adult bookstore via mail order, if I remember correctly. And was eventually arrested for sending obscene materials and so on. The case was heard, and it came up with what is known as the Miller test, which is a 3-part test to determine whether or not something is obscene or merely indecent. So the first part of the test is whether or not the material, oh, and I'm sorry, before I get into this, this is what is known in the legal arena as a reasonable person standard. This is what makes it a moral judgment, but by contemporary standards, and contemporary standards being an ever-evolving standard. So essentially, what is considered obscene 50 years ago is not necessarily considered obscene today by a reasonable person. So the Miller test determines whether or not the average person using contemporary adult standards, number one, would find the matter as a whole appealing only to prurient interests. Meaning that, is it only appealing to baser interests, baser instincts? Essentially, is this just porn, right? Number two, again, whether the average person would find the matter as a whole patently offensive, which of course is a different thing. You may not find it to be prurient, but you might, or maybe it is prurient, but you don't find it to be offensive. Like, if we look at ancient Greek sculptures and stuff like that, right? Almost all of those sculptures were created nude. And during the Middle Ages, I think Pope Pius IV went around the Vatican with hammer and chisel, knocking the cock and balls off of all the statues because he found it to be offensive, right? But we don't look back now, even though that was the standard then, and say, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do, you know, put some fig leaves on there or something. So we would not necessarily consider it prurient, but even if we did, we wouldn't necessarily consider it to be offensive because it's art, right? And that's an evolving standard. It has changed and does continue to change. And then lastly, whether a reasonable person finds the matter as a whole lacks any artistic, political, or scientific value. This last one is really the crux of the matter when we're talking about stuff on the internet, because it's very difficult. A lot of material on the internet obviously applies only to prurient interests. A lot of material on the internet is obviously patently offensive. But we have trouble regulating because of this last one, because it's so difficult to say what does or does not contain any value. Now, before we go today, let's talk a little bit about all the laws you've broken. Did you know that it's illegal to send people shock links? So sending somebody goatse, lemon party, 2 girls, 1, don't add to my list, okay? I don't need to add to my list. Don't send me emails or whatever. They're illegal. The criminal code in the United States is 18 USC. 18 USC 2252C, misleading words or digital images on the internet. Essentially, if you embed within the code of a website, i.e. if you post online, a link that goes to a place that is offensive, or in the case of minors, merely indecent, and so on, without clearly labeling them as being potentially offensive, it's illegal. Why don't people go to jail for it? Well, in the case of the internet, this is one of those things of like, well, who are you going to report it to, right? You're going to report it to the moderators. Maybe they'll remove it. Nobody's calling the cops on anybody. Although, just so you know, there have been cases where the authorities have been contacted, and the couple of cases I'm thinking of off the top of my head apply strictly to when minors received shock links. But they did get involved and people were punished for it, either in a legal sense or were banned from the site as a result. Merely broadcasting obscene language is not illegal right now, but certainly could be. The only reason that it's not technically illegal right now is because, again, the web content hosts are considered distributors because of Section 230 rather than publishers. Somebody could come after you individually for your speech online, but to my knowledge, other than threats, no one has ever really been prosecuted for this. Generally speaking, if you say something mean online, it's probably not going to be the feds that come after you. It will probably be local authorities. And I can tell you from personal experience, the local authorities do get involved if you make threats online. They will call somebody like me to look into it, and you will be charged with crimes under Wisconsin law, not usually this one. Wisconsin has a number of content regulation laws, especially when it comes to harassment online or even threats of violence. So, as my old mentor in the forensic game once told me, don't say anything in print that you don't want blown up in 10-foot tall letters on the wall of the courtroom. So broadcasting, however, the reason that this might be legal someday is because despite the protections under 230, the DMCA and other such laws, if for some reason there was a push in this nation, this is a nation of laws, of course. Does anybody know how many federal laws we happen to have on the books? It's a trick question. Nobody does. That's right. Nobody does. The federal government, actually, the Department of Justice, at one point decided to count the number of federal laws on the books. They stopped because there were too many to count. So who knows? This is a nation of laws. And what that means, essentially, is that we don't know what's legal and what's not legal until somebody crosses the line and they get prosecuted for it, and then the trier of fact makes that determination, then it becomes a case law. But we do know that broadcasting is an exception to the freedom of speech that we enjoy in the Bill of Rights, and does not need to meet the requirements of the Miller test to be restricted. We have a right to indecent material under the First Amendment. We do not have the right to broadcast indecent material under the First Amendment, because the government, again, can regulate the time, place, and manner of our speech. So if, for some reason, the FCC, under the guise of net neutrality, for example, we'll talk about that this week too, decides to regulate the content, then they can, under the auspices of this law, as the regulatory body of broadcasting in the United States, to essentially say that certain things can be broadcast and certain can't. Last thing for today, Lolly and Shota is also illegal. So, and this is the one where every time I give this lecture, there's at least one or two students that are just shocked to find this out. Because if you go to the wrong places on the internet, it's everywhere. And you might be wondering, well, if it's so illegal, how can that be? Well, let's talk about that. But it is illegal, first of all. 18 U.S.C. 1466A is the federal law that regulates contraband pornography, particularly where it comes to the depiction of minors. Obscene visual representations of the sexual abuse of children in general. Any person who knowingly produces, distributes, receives, possesses with intent to distribute a visual depiction of any kind, including a drawing, cartoon, sculpture, or painting that meets one of these things, essentially a minor engaging in sexually explicit conduct, or an image that appears to be a minor engaging in sexually explicit conduct. Both of those are just fine. And so you might think, okay, well, then it must be the fact that it's the 5,000-year-old demon defense, which is to say that a lot of these images are from some manga or anime or something like that, where it's not really an 8-year-old person. She's a 5,000-year-old demon, so she's above the age of consent. No, because it does not have to actually be a minor. It can just be somebody who appears to be a minor. The real reason it's all over the place is because, well, number one, again, who are you going to call? Is the FBI going to track down and prosecute every single person that posts something like that to be? Nope. There's just not enough people to do it. But two, think about what's at stake. The legal basis we have for prosecuting somebody under this relies entirely on the Miller test. It's the only legal test we have for obscene materials. Even if those obscene materials are explicitly against the law, it still has to be proven that it is. Now, if somebody were to be pulled off of random and then hauled into court, despite their no doubt inability to defend themselves as a human being, all they need do is have a competent public defender simply state it's art. Then the federal government finds itself in the unenviable position of arguing before the court in public that this picture is not art. It has to lack any literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That's what's at stake in these cases, because what if they lose that case? The Miller test says all such material is not obscene and cannot be regulated, which is why this is fought in court all the time, but it's done very selectively. There's a lot of cases out there and you'd have to win them all. But it does happen. Like, for example, with Christian B here. Christian B, in 2011, his estranged wife, they were going through a divorce. She's going through belongings and is on a computer that her husband uses, and she finds what she believes to be child pornography. So she contacts the authorities. The computer is seized by investigators. And what they find is a series of incest comics, jab comics. And they have a character that is below the age of consent. It's hand drawn, so it's certainly not a case of there being a real victim out there. But it's kind of an open and shut case when it comes to the contraband images law. So he was actually prosecuted for it, and he was convicted for it. He went to jail for 3 years and had to register as a sex offender as a result. So it does happen. People are caught, they are prosecuted. But note, important distinction in this case, while I personally am convinced that at least 60% of the people on poll are federal agents, they're not out there looking for these cases. This was a case where it was reported to them. So it was kind of an open and shut case. They had access to the evidence, and there was, Christian B did not even really enter a defense in this case. I believe that he initially pled not guilty, but then took a plea deal and pled guilty, and that's when he was sentenced. All right, let's leave it there. We'll pick up with this one next time. Take care.